Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the parallel session, Sport Safe from Violence, Our Concern, Our Response, organized by the Council of Europe. I have the pleasure today to moderate a panel of very distinguished speakers who will be talking to you about the benefits of sports as an activity which empowers young people and young athletes, but also to some of the dangers that those young athletes are exposed to when they practice sport. The Council of Europe has developed a number of standards that are legally binding to make sure that women are safe when they practice sport and to make sure that children do not become victims of sexual abuse or sexual exploitation. So you will be hearing more about these issues later on as we go through the different speakers of the panel. May I first turn to Ms. Marja Ruotanen, who is Director of Human Dignity and Equality at the Council of Europe. Marja is responsible for all Council of Europe activities related to equality, violence against women, children's rights, sport, and anti-discrimination on any grounds. Marja, you have the floor.
Thank you, Liri. Back in December, when the Council of Europe decided to do this parallel event on Safe from Fear, we wanted to use the environment that sport has and the power that sports have to promote the conventions that we have at the Council of Europe on combating violence against women and sexual abuse of children. And having listened to the 2 last days of discussions, I'm actually more and more convinced that the topic we chose was really timely, and I have been taken back because I didn't realize that how big of a problem this is all over in the world, and also how much commitment there is amongst the participants to address it, and how urgent it is to address it. So I'm really happy about the topic and also the feedback we have got so far from you on recognizing that these are major problems. As Liri mentioned, at the Council of Europe, which I'm working at, it's an international organization, we produce brilliant conventions. We have conventions on violence against women and domestic violence, and conventions on fighting sexual abuse of children. They are brilliant, as I said. Why? Because they are groundbreaking in the way that they address these problems from different P areas, as we call them as lawyers at the Council of Europe. They address the prevention, they address the protection of victims, and of course the prosecution of the perpetrators. And lastly, which is very important, they really promote the inter-policy approach, meaning that none of these violations or crimes can be sorted out just by focusing on one area, and you need the approach where all those who are concerned with the possible problem work together. Why I said they are brilliant? They are groundbreaking, but also all these conventions are equipped with the monitoring mechanism. That means that not only the states who are acceded to them have to implement them, but they are monitored by one by independent body and the other one from another type of body, that the countries actually do what they have promised to do. So there is no more estimations, because today, as we often say we estimate that 1 in 5 child has been exposed to sexual abuse or sexual violation. But once we have this information from the monitoring, we know exact figures, we have evidence. And evidence is so important when the member states, the authorities, decide what to do. And it's also important because that way nobody can deny the problem, and it has to be on top of the political agendas. So these groundbreaking tools are also important because they list what is violation. They criminalize these violations. Yesterday in one of the parallel sessions there was a discussion about what is included in violation. We need a definition. But if you look at the Istanbul Convention, actually the definition is there. That means sexual abuse, psychological, physical abuse, harassment, stalking, rape. There's a long list of things that are actually now crime. But how do we implement this? These are brilliant pieces of paper, these conventions, but how do we ensure that they don't just stay on the desks of us civil servants or the states that have ratified them? How do we bring them to the possible victims, or those sportswomen or sportsmen who think that they might have actually been victims of violation? And I think that's exactly what we need from this event, is to bring these conventions to those who can actually bring them to those possible victims. Of course, first and foremost, it is the states that are responsible for implementing them. But the conventions are also very clear, it is all of us. It's not only the states, but it is everybody in the society who no more can turn a blind eye if they see abuse or violation. You cannot say that you don't see what happened, you have to report it, you have to act. And I think this is what is important. They are no more private matters, but they are public, and they are criminal offenses. Media plays an important role, of course. And I'm not going into that direction now because I know that Laura will be talking about it a lot, but so do the coaches and sportswomen and sportsmen, because it's for them also to set the model, to lead the trend, to make the change, because the mindsets have to be changed. If in the coaching or in the team, everything is tolerated because they are the rules of the game, don't say anything, this has happened before, and where the coach has actually a lot of authority and the children are afraid to speak because they don't want to risk their possible place in the team. So the coach have a huge role to play here to make sure that the children or the victims actually know what is wrong, what can be done, and where are the limits. There have to be very clear rules. I think one of the most important things is to talk to the possible victims. How do you break the silence? Whom do they turn to? Whom do they call? I think in every sport association you have to set rules and procedures. There has to be a person possibly to whom you turn to in a case. Because a child or young person might not know, is it something wrong that happened to me? Or is this normal? Is it something that I have to show I'm a man, I'm a woman, I have to endure everything that I'm asked to do by the coach? So whom does this person talk to? In the sport, there are a lot of volunteer workers, but they are just as responsible as those who have a contract and a paid assignment with the team. So this is important to recognize that everybody is held responsible under these two conventions. You have to do training. I think what is important is to train the coaches before they actually go and do their job. It is important also to give some training also for the children so that they know, and the youngsters, they know how to do and whom to call. They have to know that there are telephone numbers, hotlines, where they can speak without giving their name confidentially and ask and try to see whether actually what happened to them is right or wrong. And what actually would be ideal is that by doing this one phone call or approaching one person, it would be a one-stop guichet, or what we could call that you only have to testify once, like we do in some of the Nordic countries with the barnhuset or child houses, where you explain only once what happened to you, and by that you reach all the professionals who actually can help you, so that you don't have to tell the story over and over again and try to get sometimes even sympathy. So I think this is important. There would be one stop line only. When traveling to here, I was reading the Helsingin Sanomat, where I read a very interesting article whereby in some parts of Finland they have started to use this MARAC, which is the multi-agency risk conference, where all those professionals that deal with issues like that come together and assess the risks as to how to go about, what response to give. And I think this is maybe one of the examples that could be also taken forward also in the area of sport to address this crime. I have also read very recently in some of the papers that in Canada, in fact, they are setting up now an independent ice hockey league where the non-violence and safe environment is the motto of the whole thing. And I think this is really encouraging because I think many children and teenagers, they actually have quit sport because of bullying, because of sexual abuse and violence that they have experienced. And we have to act now. It just cannot go on like that. So I just want to make the link with these important, brilliant treaties that we have. And I want your help also to make sure that they don't stay as piece of papers, that all of you, the professional coaches, players, look at them and you think, what can you do to make sure that this crime is stopped in the sports audience? I think I stopped there, Liri, because I want to give time for the others as well.
Thank you very much, Marja. Indeed, it is very important, the point that you're making about bringing together all the relevant stakeholders to give life to those important treaties. You talked about good practices. You mentioned Maraxa, you mentioned the one-stop centers where children can go for help. And indeed, we should look at those legally binding instruments as a collection of good practices because they don't come from nowhere. They are based into existing good examples from the different member states, which then have been turned into a legally binding instrument. So the way to look at those treaties is exactly that, good practices which should be multiplicated in other countries. And now I will turn to Laura Bates. Laura is the founder of Everydaysexism, which has become an extremely powerful book, which gives a voice to the hundreds and thousands of women that are victims of sexism or harassment. Laura is a journalist and a writer and has been, recently she joined the top 10 power list of the most influential women in the United Kingdom. And she has been tirelessly campaigning against sexism and discrimination that women face in everyday life. Laura, I give you the floor.
Thank you. I want to start by talking a little bit about the media. We're used to seeing women sexualized, objectified, and dehumanized in the media. But when it comes to sporting women, it's even more complex, and I think the impact can be even greater. While articles and features about male athletes focus on their skill and their talent, female sports stars are portrayed again and again as sex objects first and foremost and athletes second. While male athletes during the last Olympics were questioned in the UK press about their tactics and the techniques that they would be using, we saw article after article where female athletes, our Olympians, our medal winners, were asked about their pre-race beauty regimes. They were asked about what kind of hair products they used that wouldn't come off in the water if they were swimmers. They were asked about what they'd be doing with their nails on the big day. And while articles about male athletes were mainly illustrated with images of them in their kit, in a sporting moment, in the heat of the action, again and again we saw female sports stars being asked to pose in ball gowns, in couture, in dresses that were completely unrelated to the reason why they were in the spotlight, or even very often in their underwear or wearing nothing at all. And what this does is it removes women from the immediacy of their sporting careers. It removes that from being the primary association that we have with them, and it portrays them as sex objects first and athletes second. And the impact of this is complex. Firstly, it contributes to a lack of respect for female athletes, but also a real irrelevant focus on their looks and their sexiness, which again and again seems to presuppose the importance of their careers. For example, when Marion Bartoli won Wimbledon, in the UK, the commentator John Inverdale, in the middle of the match, whilst she was at the high point of her career, said to his fellow commentator live on air, I wonder if her father said to her one day that she was never going to be a looker. He suggested that maybe the reason why she'd become a tennis star was because, first and foremost, a woman's objective was to be beautiful, but that wasn't an option in her case. And what that meant was not only that she suffered that in the moment, but also that the headlines afterwards were dominated by this row about sexism in the moment of her achieving the greatest pinnacle of her career. When Eugenie Bouchard became the first Canadian to reach a Grand Slam semi-final in 30 years, the courtside reporter commented on her looks and talked about her legion of male fans. And then with any number of possible questions to ask her about her victory or about how she saw the tournament going ahead, asked her which famous person she would like to date. And predictably, the headlines followed. So the headlines following this historic victory weren't tennis star breaks Canadian records or athlete at the top of her game or even just Bouchard reaches Grand Slam semi-final, but Eugenie Bouchard picks Justin Bieber as dating material. Canadian tennis glamour girl says she'd date Justin Bieber. And my personal favorite, Eugenie Bouchard, the believer, reaches Melbourne semi-finals. When we represent female athletes as sex objects in the media, we undermine their ability to be taken seriously within their field, contributing to the appalling lack of respect and coverage given both to them as individuals but also to women's sport more widely. In the UK, only 7% of sports coverage features women. For every 53 articles written about sporting men, there's one about women's sport. It receives 0.4% of the total sponsorship that goes into sport in the UK, and in publicly funded sport, only 20% of board positions are held by women. And the sexualization and objectification of women in sport also has another even wider reaching impact. It creates a double standard where men in sport are judged for their talent and prowess, but women are judged on their looks first, even while they're playing. And the impact of this on young women really can't be underestimated. We're facing a real crisis of girls' under-participation in sport at the moment. And again, my reference point is the UK, where our National Health Service shows that only 12% of 14-year-old girls do enough sport to meet the recommended guidelines for physical activity. And when you look at adult women, over 80% don't do enough physical activity to benefit their health. And the really crucial thing is to kind of peel back the layers and have a look at some of the reasons for that. And the evidence does suggest that they're gendered. For example, girls are doing around half the amount of sport and physical activity as boys are by the time they hit the age of 10. And some recent research by the Women's Sport and Fitness Foundation in 2011 found that 48% of girls were worried that sweating wasn't feminine, and nearly a third were afraid that boys didn't find sporty girls feminine. And with young women citing these reasons for being put off sport, suddenly the media fixation with looks and sexiness of female athletes can only compound the problem. And it also feeds into another major barrier which prevents women from enjoying sport, which I think these things are all very closely interrelated. And again, very much coming back to this idea of focusing on women looking at their looks, talking about them as sex objects when they're doing sport. And this is the problem of sexual harassment. The sexual harassment of women obviously is an issue across a broad fields and contexts, but it's particularly relevant in relation to sport because so much physical activity takes place outside and within public spaces. There was a survey in 2008 by the American organization Stop Street Harassment, which found that 24% of American women do not exercise outside because of fear of harassment or assault. If you extrapolate that to the American population, that's 36 million women. The Everydaysexism project, which is the project I run, receives testimonies from people all over the world about any kind of experience they have of harassment or gender inequality on a day-to-day basis. We've received hundreds and hundreds of reports every year from women who are put off exercising outside because they experience serious harassment, verbal harassment, physical assault, being followed, being stalked, being photographed, and being threatened when they try to exercise outside. I want to read you just a couple of their testimonies to give you an idea of the kind of thing that's reported to us again and again. I'm a keen runner in the local area. I run in usual running attire, lycra, a fluorescent jacket, trainers. Almost every time I go on my 4-mile run around the local town, I'm beeped at by cars, lorries, or vans for no reason other than that I'm a woman running. This happens on industrial estates in the dark and has led me to run with a rape alarm because it's made me feel so unsafe. Another. While jogging in a park one afternoon, I was stopped by a man on a bike who asked for directions. Within moments of answering, he started making suggestive comments about my appearance. When I ran on towards the nearest public road, he followed me on his bike and verbally detailed how he was planning to rape me. At some point, he grabbed me, lost balance, and fell from his bike while I thrashed. I ran for the nearest bushes and hid for what seemed like forever until another couple walked past. I can no longer run without the fear of this happening again. Another. For the second time in a week, I've been heckled whilst out running. Today, 3 teenage boys shouted something after me, and when I didn't react, they demanded, well, laugh then, and then one of them shouted, I'm going to smack you in the fanny. This is from a cyclist. I had my left foot up on the curb, my right on the pedal. A car pulled up alongside with 2 men in it. The passenger reached out and grabbed my bum, giving it a hard squeeze. I was shocked. I was overcome with fear and the feeling of being violated. And these are not isolated incidents, as you can see from that statistic of a quarter of American women avoiding outdoor exercise, because these kinds of experiences are so normalized. These kinds of experiences are so normalized that we hear from women who adopt defense mechanisms before they even go out running. They wear headphones so they don't have to hear the harassment. They change their route to avoid places it's happened before. They run with their keys between their fingers because they're so scared of being attacked. And the normalization of viewing female athletes as sex objects leads to an increased risk that they too will experience sexual harassment in their interactions with the public. When one of our greatest Olympic gymnasts, Beth Tweddle, took part in a question and answer and interactive session on Twitter recently for Sky Sports, these are some of the sexist and abusive comments that were directed at her. Sky Sports invited people to take this opportunity to ask questions of an Olympic medal winner. And the questions included, on a scale of 1 to 10, how pig ugly would you class yourself? Are all sportswomen lesbians? Why did you turn down the role of Lord Voldemort? Commenters described her as slag, slut, and dirty bitch, and talked about having anal sex with her. And again, I'm not cherry-picking these comments. They actually far outweighed the number of comments that had serious questions to put to her. And finally, for professional athletes, the close and intense relationship between athlete and coach can present an opportunity for inappropriate behavior or even abuse. And we've received several reports of this kind of thing to the Everyday Sexism project, many involving sexism and sexual comments and inappropriate behavior, but also several describing groping and sexual abuse. And several of the women, and in some cases very young girls, who reported these things to us talked about having left the sport altogether to try and avoid the situation. And it's important to stress, obviously, that this is not intended to be alarmist. This is not intended to suggest for one moment that sports coaches are more likely to be perpetrators than at any other section of society, or that they deserve undue suspicion. Indeed, we receive multiple reports of abuse from other kinds of similar situations with the same kinds of close and confined conditions, like, for example, driving instructors. It's more about suggesting that it's important to be aware of the fact that certain conditions and situations can make somebody more vulnerable to this kind of abuse. So some aspects of this situation that create these kinds of vulnerabilities are long periods of time spent alone together, the fact that there's often a large age gap, time away, time staying in accommodation, the power dynamic of teacher to student, and the vulnerability of somebody who's dependent on their coach for career success, and the intensity of training situations. Abuse is about power and control, and each of these factors could exacerbate the situation by isolating the victim and making them vulnerable. So taking all of these elements together, I think it's very important to look at the connections between them. Just before we walked out on stage, the Daily Telegraph, one of our biggest newspapers in the UK, published an article about the World Cup. It was aimed at women, and it said, intelligent things you can say to pretend that you know about football, I'm paraphrasing, when your boyfriend is watching the World Cup. And again, whether it's the adverts that are on at the moment in the UK for Pringles, which show the boys trying to watch the football on the TV while their nagging wives are ringing up on the phone, whether it's those images that show female athletes in their underwear and male athletes in their sports kit, whether it's the way that young girls at school are being taught that their bodies are so important that they should be worried about getting sweaty in case boys don't find them attractive. What we're creating is an atmosphere in which, first of all, the message is that sport isn't really for girls, and second of all, the message is that if girls do want to go into sport, then they have to look sexy while they're doing it. And so this can seem like an insurmountable obstacle. It might feel very kind of difficult looking at all these things together, like a daunting problem to tackle. But there are excellent instruments and guidelines available to help. And again, just to kind of point towards the Istanbul Convention and the Lanzarote Convention by the Council of Europe, and to look specifically at how they might be applied to some of the issues that I've raised today. The Istanbul Convention contains really strong guidelines for the prevention of gender stereotyping and the objectification representation of women, including working in partnership with the media to portray women with dignity and respect. It also points to teaching materials on gender equality and non-stereotype gender roles in schools, but also sports and leisure facilities, which could have a big impact on offsetting some of those damaging norms and ideas around women in sport. And the Lanzarote Convention contains really strong guidelines for the prevention of abuse in scenarios that could involve child athletes, such as the screening and training of coaches and the teaching of young people about their risks and their rights. Sport has the potential to be such a great equalizer. Women should be able to shine just as much as their male peers in professional sports, as well as benefiting from the myriad health and well-being aspects of recreational sport. But in order for that to truly happen, we obviously have many hurdles to overcome, and it really takes all of us to take a very firm and frank look at those things and see how we can try and tackle them head on rather than sweeping them under the carpet.
Thank you very much, Laura. The research and work carried out by the Everydaysexism project does show us the huge amount of challenges ahead. But it's also an important work because at the same time, it shows that victims or potential victims are not alone. And as you said, that we should use to gather support and give a voice to all those people that are victims of abuse and harassment. And indeed, you mentioned the extremely important role that the media has to play in this respect. And before I move on to the next speaker, use the social networks, which Laura has been using very successfully in her work, including with regard to the ongoing event. You can use Twitter for questions and comments, and then at the end of the interventions, there will of course be a possibility for questions and comments to the members of the panel. And I would like now to move on to our next speaker, George Nikolaidis. George is a very experienced researcher and has hands-on experience with regard to working with children that have been victims of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. And he will bring us some of that work and experience that he's been doing to the panel today. George, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As said, I will try to make a brief sum up of the Lanzarote Convention, since I represent here the Committee of Parties of the Lanzarote Convention, and then move on to my personal experience in working, especially with children victimized within the sports context, which is our topic in a sense today. Lanzarote Convention, since the last 7-8 years, has been a main instrument in promoting safety of children in many contexts. 47 states have signed, 31 legislative bodies, parliaments have ratified the convention, and it has a lot of provisions to protect children from sexual victimization. In Council of Europe, we do believe in dialogue in non-violent ways, so we believe in persuasion. So our means are mainstreaming, networking, making campaigns, promoting good practices, awareness raising. So we're not a mandatory body, we are a voluntary body. Sometimes, maybe in the bottom of our minds, we think if only we have the power to enforce, but then we think compliant subjects are not good allies. Good allies are the ones that are persuaded for the rightfulness of the cause. So we try to do that in collaboration with many other organizations like the European Commission, like the United Nations, WHO, and other. And this strategy has been working in many states. New legislation have been passed in protecting children in many sectors of life, like justice, like in sports. Gradually, the atmosphere is changing, and there is a respect for children's rights, and procedures are being introduced to protect their rights. In that aspect, we have organized the 1 in 5 campaign, because evidence shows that 1 in 5 children in their childhood, they would have at least one adverse sexual experience throughout their childhood, and this has been effective in most of the European countries. And also, because we believe in internal collaboration, we also have initiated a number of activities with EPAS, the sector of the Council of Europe that is up to the business of promoting conducts codes of conduct within the sports context. And because also we had a number of reports growing through the last 2 decades about the extent in which sexual victimization of children actually occurs within the sports context. And several key figures have had the courage of speaking out and revealing the truth for what's happened. On October 2013, a conference was organized in Budapest with this exact body, and I remember a colleague there saying that, for instance, in UK, we have somehow pushed forward the agenda of any sports club having to introduce an item on the security procedures in every meeting. And sometimes it is as if, okay, this item is because we are mandated to do so. But again, installing this is better than not have been installed in the first place. And he is right, because this is the beginning, it's not the end of activities to protect children from sexual victimization within the sports context. Now, I will move to my personal experience. As said, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a researcher. I have been working within research project, probably the biggest research on the extent of children's victimization in Europe, funded by the European Commission. And on spring 2011, I was puzzled by the result of a particular prefecture in my own country, in Greece, in prefecture of Rethymnon. In that particular prefecture, the ratios between boys and girls in their self-reported adverse sexual experiences was reversed than the anticipated one. Usually it is the case that the ratio is 2-to-1 girls to boys, but in that particular prefecture, it was the opposite. And initially, we thought it was some bias, but on December 1st, 2011, the local police made an arrest and disclosed the biggest case of pedophilia in Greece, I think of all times. The coach of a local basketball team for boys and adolescents has created a sort of a pyramid operating for 8 years or more, involving more than 200 boys throughout these years. And this pyramid was functioning like that. In the first stage of introduction, the boys were challenged to suffer physical constraint, physical pain, left in midnight in cemeteries and other stuff like that. And those who passed this stage were eligible to be called for the second stage, which was conducting sexual practices between them, and the coach was just watching. And those passing the second stage were eligible for being called upon the third stage, in which the coach himself was actually molesting children. With this structure, the rationale behind this perverted pyramid was to overcome one's limits, to be able to achieve things. And this way, the victims became recruiters of other boys. They were demonstrating the participation within this structure. And as a matter of fact, even after the arrest, half of the victims are still in favor of the coach, who is now, of course, in prison. Now, given this, we try to make an intervention plan in the local city. Take into account this particular city is a city of 20,000 inhabitants, 200 boys within the last 8 years. That equivalent is to a total disruption of the social structure of the local society. And for that purpose, we try to organize a massive health promotion campaign in all schools of the prefecture, which insofar has included more than 5,000 students and parents in 40 schools and teachers in 40 schools. Not addressing victims anymore, but trying to reopen the issue of sexuality to all the local community, to all children in local community. And we also provided clinical services to more than 400 children, because apart from those involved, there were many more that suffered from distress and other implications of this issue. But also we worked with professionals, and in particular with gymnasts and local coaches, sports coaches associations, in order to introduce some other ways of doing the business. Because, you know, in the first months after the disclosure, the impact was that the gymnasts could not touch the children, but they could not do their own job if they didn't touch the children. So if knowledge is lacking, we move from one side to the opposite because we don't know how to do it. So we worked on making people aware of how they could do that. And one thing more that we had found was that from all this that has been going on in this local community for more than 8 years, parents knew very little. And I think that by and large, responsible for that was that the local culture is a very traditional, macho, male chauvinist culture. So the boys that were introduced to this network, to this pyramid, were more afraid to speak about that in their father than staying silent forever. So we also try to work on the concept of masculinity as it is demonstrated in these traditional stereotypes. So to sum up, what we try to do is to pass a few messages, which I will just repeat and leave it there for questions. The first one, especially within the sports context, is that overcoming one's limits can only be accepted conditionally, but not unconditionally. Performance and make it happen does not come whatever that might take. This has to be taught to children and educated to people which work with children that this can only happen conditionally, not unconditionally. Second, participation and involvement of the families to all aspects of their children's lives, including sports, is unconditional and should be allowed and promoted and facilitated, because as many people as they are involved, and especially their own caregivers of the children, this provides a very secure environment for all the people to do their jobs without fear, and the children not to be victimized. Third, we have to reconsider the traditional stereotypical styles of masculinity as they are, and especially are reproduced in some aspects of the sports mechanism, but not only the sports mechanism. This is a very wider concept that has to be worked and reformed. Fourth and last is that knowledge and speaking about this issue is not something that makes children any harm. On the contrary, it protects them and makes a lot of people relieved. Going there 1.5 years ago, this is a rural community, as I told you, a very traditional macho man community. I was afraid that working on this subject, I might face some hostility from the local community. I must tell you, I am impressed by the fact that the society is more ready than we think to receive these messages. These resistances are more to our minds, to administration maybe, to key stakeholders, but not to local communities, to real communities. So I will close with our intervention program slogan, which is, I know, I speak, I change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. You've touched upon a very few important points, one of them being the importance of raising awareness and bringing in all the relevant stakeholders, not least the local community and the families. You also spoke about the importance of challenging but also changing attitudes and cultural and tradition, and how to also redefine that role of what masculinity really means, that it's not about power, but it's about communication and education, two very important and key points. Ladies and gentlemen, I am in a country where ice hockey, I understand, is extremely important. Now, our next speaker, and I will introduce him first with the sports one, more for educating myself than the audience that is very sports aware, is Theoren Fleury, who is a former NHL All-Star ice hockey player, Stanley Cup Champion, gold medal Olympian, and author of the best-selling book, Playing with the Fire. Theo, with his courageous and powerful story, gives hope to the other victims of sexual abuse. He has become a very vocal advocate for all the young people that have suffered sexual abuse and continues his campaigning to first raise awareness about sexual abuse, second, to put in place support systems for the victims, and third, to bring perpetrators to justice. Theo, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm one of the very few men in the world that speak openly about my experience with sexual abuse. And my book came out in 2009. And I remember 4 days before the book came out, I was extremely fearful of, having to talk to the media first and then have all of you read the book, because I didn't know how you were going to react to the content that was in the book. But what I quickly realized is that something that, something that I thought was uncommon is the most common thing in the world, and that is sexual abuse to children. I know the panelists have said 1 in 5. We just had a study come out in Canada that says 1 in 3. So there's 10 million survivors in Canada of sexual abuse. And, I go all over Canada speaking about my experience with sexual abuse. I was raped 150 times by a coach from the ages of 14 to 16. And what it caused me is it caused me a whole bunch of problems and issues in my adulthood. So I got involved in addictions, alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, food, workaholics, you name it. I'm a member of all the A groups, 12-step groups. And not only that, I had all kinds of problems in relationships, with family members, with former girlfriends, partners, wives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So not only is sexual abuse detrimental, but it manifests itself in so many other areas in our lives. So, for example, you see a guy at a local bar who can't even stand up and can't even pronounce words. I pretty much can guarantee you that that person was sexually abused at some point in their life, because there's no point or there's no reason for somebody to be that inebriated in a public place, right? And it is the biggest epidemic on the planet. I have not come across anything that is bigger than this. I've had over 500,000 reveals since I revealed my own abuse. And whether it's walking down the street in Canada and somebody comes up and tells me their story, or via email, or either on Facebook or Twitter, whatever it is. And when people say, well, that stat's got to be wrong, I say, no, I've seen it with my own eyes. I've heard it with my own ears. And like all the panelists have said, it's about power. It's about power, I had a very difficult childhood. Both my parents suffered through their own addictions. And when this particular abuser came into my life, He showered me with all the things that I didn't get at the beginning of my life. He gave me attention. He gave me opportunity. I trusted him. And because of that, he took advantage of all of that and groomed me to the point where he could, do his own addiction, which is pedophilia. And for the first few years after my book came out, I was all about justice and putting these guys in jail and locking and throwing away the key. And in Canada, we don't have a justice system. We have a system that coddles and protects pedophiles. Did you know, by the time a pedophile gets caught, on average, by the time they get caught, they have 125 victims by the time they get caught. And when we put them in jail, when they get out, 98% of those pedophiles reoffend again. And so if we're going to stop the cycle of abuse, going through my own process of healing, I don't care about justice because I'm healed. And so I advocate hope, I advocate healing, and I advocate more conversation around this subject. Because more conversation allows others to get rid of their shame, come forward, tell their stories, and then start their journey of healing. And I realize that I'm in therapy for the rest of my life, and what a gift that is for me. Because when I sit down and I bear down and I talk about my feelings and talk about the issues, my life gets better and better and better and better and better. And through my example, other people find that strength and that hope. And then they come forward and start their own healing journey. So, I think what we can all take from the conference is that it's okay to talk about this subject. You remember when breast cancer first started? Not a lot of women wanted to talk about breast cancer, but we're all talking about it now. Men with prostate cancer, we're all talking about it. Well, I see this as we're kind of at the beginning, And because shame is obviously attached to this subject, it is very difficult for people to come forward. And you know what? I don't ever consider myself a victim, because if I was a victim, that would suggest that I played a part in what happened to me. So I'm a survivor, and I'm a victor over child sexual abuse. I think using the word victim shames even more. So we need to get rid of that word, because it happened to me, and I wasn't responsible for it. And it certainly wasn't my fault. If you've seen the movie Good Will Hunting, Will at the end of the movie having his conversation with Robin Williams keeps reiterating to Will that it wasn't his fault. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault. And then we see Will's wall break down. He cries, and then the next scene, you see him empowered, where he's going to get the job and he's going to get the girl. And so, the more we shame people around the subject, the more likely it is that we're going to stay silent. But it's the biggest epidemic on the planet. So, I went through it. You went through it. Let's work towards healing. Because healing is possible, and I'm living proof of that. I have the greatest life you can possibly imagine today because I talk about it. And I don't care what anybody thinks about me. I don't care. Because I've often said, if I got to compare my life to your life to make myself feel better, then I'm sick and I need help, right? So we've got to make changes, and we've got to allow people to tell us their deepest, darkest secrets without judgment, without ramifications, and just be human beings and say it's okay. It's okay. And where do you want to go from here? And how can I help you? And how can I help you get to where you need to go? Because, you know, when I talk about miracles, okay? And basically, I never slept a wink for 27 years of my life because I was molested in a dark room. And so every night I went to bed and I closed my eyes, I was in that dark room by myself, and I'd have flashbacks and nightmares and all that kind of stuff. And you know, my miracle is today is that I'm going to go to the Ruotanen tonight here in Helsinki, and I'm going to go up to my room, and I'm going to lay my head on the pillow, and I'm going to go to sleep. And that's my miracle, because I'm talking about it, and I don't have any more shame, and I certainly know that it wasn't my fault. And I think that's the message that you want to take away from today, is that if you've gone through this and you haven't talked about it, you're not alone. And the shame that you've been carrying around for all these years is not yours to bear. It belongs to the abuser. It belongs to your abuser. And that's an important message in itself. So thank you for allowing me to speak. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Theo. And as you say in your book, the key to abuse is secrecy. And once that secret is out, the spell is broken. So indeed, extremely important to get out there. You also spoke about healing, you spoke about hope, you spoke about a safety network being in place for the survivors of sexual abuse. There is a lot of tweeting going on, and people are thanking you for the courage and speaking up about this very important issue. You also spoke about the importance of empowerment, very important indeed, to be by the side of the victim in order, or the survivor, in order to empower them and to be able to allow them to speak about such abuse. We come to the end of the interventions in this session, and would like now to open up the floor for the audience to be able to comment on the interventions or ask questions to the members of the panel. There will be a couple of people helping around with the microphones, so please, the floor is with the audience.
Hi, I'm Nina Taroi. I'm from the Finnish Olympic Committee. This question goes to Theo. I'm wondering what made you to speak up? Like, how did you start your process of healing, and who were the first people that you contacted?
Well, I knew I was going to die if I kept going down the road that I was going to, and I didn't want to die. You know, I played a very macho sport, and I've always said, you know, give me physical pain, I'll heal from physical pain. You know, if I get my teeth knocked out, they can be replaced. If I break my nose, it'll heal, you know, that kind of stuff. But emotional pain, I would never wish that on my worst enemy. And for many, many years, I was paralyzed by emotional pain from the scars that were left, not only from growing up in an addictive household, but also, you know, the abuse that I suffered. And I knew that I wasn't showing the world the true me, the full potential of me. And, I tried to commit suicide 9 years ago, not because I wanted to die, but I wanted to just kill the pain that was inside of me that I could never get rid of. Because I can't go to a doctor and say, you know what, doc, I'm in a lot of pain. Not physical pain, but emotional pain. And can you write me a prescription for child sexual abuse? Can you give me a pill for that? And he's going to look at me and go, I don't have anything for that. And so I got to the point where I didn't care anymore about what anybody thought. It was my truth and my story. And there should be nothing wrong with that. And so I basically wrote the book and told the world what happened to me. And you guys didn't run away. You didn't shame me. You know what you said? You told me I had courage. And you told me I had strength. And from that, I became empowered. So why can't we do that for everybody in the world who has gone through the exact same experience?
Any other comments or questions from the audience?
Thank you very much. My name is Therese Murphy. I really enjoyed the contributions here this afternoon, and I want to thank you very much, all of you, for the work that you put into it. I'm curious about your views on the way forward. And I think the problem that we have with around gender-based violence and sexual violence is around not being able to quantify it. So it's really difficult then to make good policies and good interventions. So I'd be curious to know if you have any views on where we could start. At what level does it have to start? Is it something for the Council of Europe? Is it something for individual countries or individual sports organisations? Where can we start so that we can quantify the problem in some structured way so that we can approach it and solve it so that future generations don't have to suffer in this way? Thank you.
Anyone from the members of the panel that may wish to start? Because I think this is a question which doesn't have a definite answer from one single member of the panel. We spoke a lot about cooperation and the importance of coordinating and bringing in all the relevant stakeholders. Laura or Marja, you want to start with this, or?
Well, I think the most important thing I see is really to break the silence. You have to talk about it, and I think they already gave examples where there was a bit taboo, it was a private thing. Another one that comes to mind is corporal punishment of children. Maybe before my generation it was okay to slap and punish corporal children. It was a taboo, nobody spoke about it. But now it's not more acceptable by the society. So I think you have to speak about it. You have to make it known that it's not a private problem, and also that we are all responsible. It's not the problem of or state or somebody who has to actually act, but it's everybody's problem. If you see you're responsible, you have to react. So I think this is one of the things. You have to raise the awareness about it. And then you have to give very practical tools to explain to those who are victims so that they know that actually they have been the victims, or survivors, use that word, so that know that they are not to blame, but somebody else is to be blamed, and also to explain them exactly whom to turn to, what they can do.
I think it has to be about that specific issue of cooperation. It's not something that works with either a grassroots or a top-down approach, but it has to be something that government takes specific responsibility for, but then also that every individual organisation takes responsibility for, and that we're then also appealing to individuals to take part in. Some years ago there was an overhaul of the approach to domestic violence in the United Kingdom, and laws were changed and it didn't have a major impact on the ground, and civil society organisations were engaged and it didn't quite work, and it wasn't until they got to the level where every different stakeholder was involved involved and was working together and communicating with one another, that suddenly things started to shift and they saw a massive shift in cases. So I think that it's perhaps useful to think of this as something that needs to be integrated at every stage, rather than something that we think of as a patch or something that we sign up to kind of as an afterthought or a separate issue. It's something that should be integrated within the policies, as was mentioned, of every sports club, of every committee, of every event that's being planned. It needs to be something that's thought of as integral to the planning of all of these different things, rather than something kind of separate and other. And I think it's something that we all have to be responsible for at every stage.
George?
If I understood correctly, your question is where to begin with. And without any objection to all that has been said, and of course I agree that institutional changes, reforms in legislation are useful, international collaboration, key stakeholders collaboration is important. All these are very important, and we should follow that up. But I am inclined to say that the place to begin with is us, any individual. Because if we change us, then all the rest will follow. You know, in the 90s there were simultaneously two researches in the United States and in Canada inquiring in the general population which was ranked as the most serious public health issue. Two were rating over 90% of the sample, and that was driving while drunk and child sexual abuse. In the same questionnaire, after a few items, there was another question saying, this issue that you recognized as important, if you have the hint that this might have been going on besides you in your environment, would you do something to intervene or not? In the case of drink and drive, over 90% of the sample again responded, I will intervene. In the case of child sexual abuse, that was less than 10%. Now, I think that the most important thing is to change this, and I think within the 2 decades that have passed, this has a positive development. I'm sure that if you were conducting this research again, it would be more than 10%, but I'm sure it's not like 90%, and we should work on that.
Indeed, George, you come back to that, to the importance of challenging attitudes, culture, and tradition, and bring into the open this issue, starting with each and every single individual. Because, Teresa, you mentioned whether the institutional organizations have a role. They do, and they do provide those instruments, but as Marja said, if they are there just to remain in paper and are not really put into practice, that doesn't help. And there is a role there for the media, as Laura mentioned. There is a role for the corporate, the private sector. So if each and every individual, as George said, comes together and does his or her own bit, that's when things will move forward and change.
Well, and you gotta understand, we're trying to undo thousands and thousands of years of sexual abuse. You know, this isn't a topic that just started, you know, a few years ago. This has been going on since the beginning of time. And so the leadership around the issue hasn't been great. And there is no handbook, textbook, where that I can pick up this textbook and do the textbook, and then at the end I can declare myself healed. There's no such thing. Everybody heals at a different rate and a different process. So, you know, how do we make it the easiest way to do that? I don't know, but we've got a long ways to go. And the thing about abuse is that it lasts 7 generations before somebody stops the cycle of abuse. So, you know, out of those 1 in 3 or 1 in 5 survivors of sexual abuse, 80% of those survivors have been molested by family members. So now you're talking a whole new different dynamic where who wants to upset the family apple cart? And in most experiences of people that have blown the whistle on family members, they've been extradited from the family and been cast off because nobody wants to deal with the ramifications of what happened.
Yes, shame, fear of not being understood or listened to, very complex issues which need to be tackled at every level, starting with each and every one of us. Any other questions or comments from the audience?
Don't be shy.
Maybe if there is some time that you may need on these issues, I could come back on some of the key points that we heard during the interventions from the different panelists. We spoke a lot about the need to have a safety net in place, including the one-stop points for the potential victims or survivors of sexual violence. We spoke about the importance of cooperation. We spoke about the importance of having, nevertheless, legal instruments and laws in place in order to be able to move things forward. We also spoke about awareness raising, how it is important to speak about those issues. We discussed women athletes being objects before becoming athletes, and how do we reverse that trend? How do we challenge that trend? We heard about leadership of women. Laura spoke a lot about lack of leadership of women in sport. That's also part of the problem, because it's not the same approach taken by women when they are in leadership than by men. Rather than men taking all the time the decision for women, it will be also useful to have women that take decision for themselves. We also spoke about the importance of challenging stereotypes, whether it's about women or about survivors of sexual violence, and empowerment was a word that was frequently mentioned by Theo, how to empower victims and make sure that they reverse that trend, that they get it out of their system and be able to move forward. And there, the key word was that it's not their fault. They have nothing to be ashamed. They are not the ones that committed something wrong. It's the perpetrator. We also spoke about the importance of bringing justice for bringing the perpetrators to justice and delivering justice to the survivors. It has been an extremely interesting discussion, and we've had some very interesting comments on Twitter and some interaction from the audience here. So I wonder if there are any other comments before we bring this parallel session to an end. Any more comments or questions? Maybe we might have other questions from the panelists. Do you have any comments? Or in terms of timing, we're doing perfectly well. We are very much in time. So if not, then I would like to thank all the panelists for their contribution to this discussion. I would also like to thank very much the participants in this parallel session. Thank you for the attention. Thank you for the contributions. And I do hope that we will be able to move things forward, and that you could all benefit from the presentations here today and from the real-life experiences that the members of the panel brought to you. Thank you very much for your attention.